Romeo tells Juliet, I love you. And Juliet replies, Rosalind does not. Here, this predicts that she can mean Rosalind does not love you, so the addressee, namely Romeo. So note that I use color coding for coreference to help you with the various characters. But this is not possible. We cannot interpret this as meaning Rosalind does not love you. It's only Rosalind does not love me. So note that to make sure we do get this type of judgment, I conducted an experimental studies. And so the conditions vary depending on the DPs involved in the antecedent in the elided sentence, the structural conditions, so manipulated C command and locality, and whether the constructions involve VP ellipsis or focused particles like only. So concretely, here is how the stimuli were presented. So Paul and Julie are lovers. Paul tells Julie, I adore you. Julie replies, I do too. And the question was, how natural is the following interpretation of Julie's reply? Namely, I adore you too, meaning Julie adores Paul. So here, this is the simplest case of Supersloppy reading. And participants could reply using a scale from less natural to more natural. And this one is the same, except with the strict interpretation. But note that each participant would only see one of the two readings, so with multiple lists. So I tested about 500 English speakers on Mechanical Turk for the 2019 paper. And for the present work on French, I tested about 150 native speakers of French on Prolific. And so as is standard, I analyzed the results statistically. So from now on, the grammaticality contrast I note or based on statistical significance in my questionnaires. So coming back to Supersloppy readings and Kaplan's theory. So we've just seen that Kaplan's fixity thesis either undergenerates by only predicting strict readings or overgenerates if we assume character copy by generating unattested Supersloppy readings. But now we know that Kaplan's fixity thesis undergenerates independently. So first, the existence of indexical shift in some languages like Sasaki, for instance, shows that context dependency does not imply fixity because operators on context do in fact exist. So for instance, here, the first person pronoun in Sasaki can be evaluated in another context than the actual one, to yield the interpretation, Hazen said that he is rich and that I am rich. And even more relevant to us, indexical binding shows that indexicals do not always have a fixed reference, even in the absence of context shift. So in sentences like sex, only I did my homework, where my seems to be bound by I, since it can be interpreted as nobody else did their homework. So now all analysis of bound indexicals like that require match in-person features. So under the so-called fake indexical analysis, my is in fact born as a minimal pronoun that acquires its person features via binding. And under the real indexical analysis, person features are presuppositional and can be ignored under focus. So thus, because they rely on person feature match, crucially for us, none of these analyses can derive Supersloppy readings because Supersloppy readings involve two different indexicals with different person features, I and U, right? So in sum, Supersloppy readings remain an issue for both Kaplan's theory and more recent analysis of indexicals that incorporate new data challenging Kaplan's theory. So to solve this problem, I propose to reduce Supersloppy readings to sloppy, so bound readings of indexicals by allowing the interpretation of U as an E-type pronoun containing a bindable variable. So we know that in so-called donkey sentences, like 7, every man who owns a donkey feeds it. It here is analyzed as basically the donkey that he owns to allow binding of he by every man who owns a donkey to allow covariation. Okay? So similarly, I hypothesize that in I love you, you can be analyzed as my interlocutor, where my is bound by I. So first evidence for binding is provided by a C-command requirement. So when U is not C-commanded by I, like in 8, so Romeo tells Juliet, the man I hate loves you, and she replies, the woman I hate does not. Here, the super sloppy reading is not available. It cannot mean the woman I hate does not love you. But the problem with this hypothesis is that indexicals are standardly assumed not to license any E-type control, based on examples like 9 from Jacobson. So this year, everyone was supposed to bring their spouse, but only Michael brought me. So here it's infelicitous because me cannot arguably be understood as his spouse, which would be the E-type control. So my proposal is that this is so because E-type control is restricted for indexicals. Namely, indexicals can only be construed as E-type pronouns if they remain indexical under that control. Therefore, the hidden description used for E-type interpretations must be indexical, which is the case of the interlocutor description I hypothesize, which I note inter, and is a relation between the speaker and the addressee of the context, the actual context. So I love you then is interpreted as I love the inter of me, so that the property copied into the ellipsis site in 1b, for instance, is the property of loving one's interlocutor, which correctly derives the reading, I do love you too. And this also correctly derives the fact that Rosalind does not, cannot be interpreted as she does not love you, because Rosalind is not a discourse participant, and thus it cannot bind the argument of inter. And the same holds for Jacobson's example, because the first spouse is not an indexical function, and Michael is not a discourse participant here. It's neither the speaker or the addressee of the context. Reversing the two indexicals, however, is correctly predicted to license supersloppy readings too, as in 11. So Lucy is arguing with her mother. She tells her, you don't understand me. And the mother replies, you don't either. Can be interpreted as you don't understand me either. Namely, me is interpreted as your interlocutor or the inter of you. And so in the ellipsis, you can bind the argument of inter since its referent is a discourse participant this time. Okay, so the first issue I left partly open in this analysis is the exact status of person features. So as I mentioned, person features are analyzed as partially absent in the analysis of bound indexicals like 6. Either because they are assumed to be only morphosyntactic features, not semantic ones, or because they are assumed to be presuppositional, and as such, they can be ignored in focus alternatives. So now the first approach is not an option for us for supersloppy reading, since there is no match in morphosyntactic features between I and you. So the question is how we can adapt the real indexical approach for supersloppy readings. So more precisely, now this what I call the real indexical approach relies on the hypothesis that indexicals are variables, so like third-person pronouns, and like what Kaplan assumes, and their context dependency is relegated in a presupposition. right? So me and you depend on the assignment function, G here, but they presuppose respectively that the referent is the speaker or that the referent is the addressee. Furthermore, the re-indexical approach crucially assumes that these presuppositions can be ignored in focus alternatives. So that's why 13 can have a sloppy reading, because in the antecedent here, my is a variable bound by I with the presupposition that the referent is the speaker. But this presupposition can disappear in the focus alternative, which is arguably at stake in the ellipsis site, so that my classmates now can bind the elided pronoun, which is just a variable without any presupposition. So similarly, I proposed that U is interpreted as the complex variable, the inter of X, with the presupposition that the referent is the addressee of the context. And this presupposition can disappear in the ellipsis site. But crucially note that here, there is, as opposed to the previous case, there is no evidence for the hypothesis that the presupposition disappears, as it is compatible with the results. In fact, it must be, due to the constraints imposed by inter. So the inter of X must be the interlocutor here, since inter only relates discourse participants. So to test whether person presuppositions are or can be ignored in focus alternatives or not under super sloppy readings, we must look at other types of examples like 14, where the two indexicals in the antecedents are reversed in the ellipsis. So I noticed you before you did, not I. And here, crucially, I found that this interpretation is possible. So before you did notice me. And this time, it crucially requires the presupposition to be ignored, even if the constraints are inter or obeyed, right? Because, so the inter of X in the antecedent is the addressee, but in the ellipsis site, it refers to the speaker. So it's still a discourse participant, so it obeys the constraints on inter, but it's not the same one. So this example suggests that super sloppy readings rely on the same mechanism as sloppy readings for ignorance of person presuppositions in focus alternatives. But the problem I encountered is that the symmetrical case yielded opposite results in my questionnaire. So you helped me, things like you helped me even when I did not, were rated as significantly degraded in the English questionnaire. So there are two possible explanations. Either presuppositions are not ignored and the presupposition of I and you are not symmetrical, as I detail in the paper, or there is an independent problem in the examples. So to settle the issue, what I did is I re-examined this question in French by constructing a new questionnaire. And so first, I tested the relevant configuration by better controlling for potential confounds. Namely, I used strictly minimal pairs and I better controlled for the pragmatics. So for instance, I contrasted 16A, moi je t'ai repéré et toi, so I spotted you, did you? With 16B, you spotted me, but I didn't. Where in both cases, the relevant property is the same, namely to spot one's interlocutor. And furthermore, reciprocity between discourse participants is under discussion here. So the question under discussion is, did we spot each other? And this is important because the licensing of inter and thus of super sloppy reading arguably depends on this. And in that case, I found no significant contrast between the two examples. Both are rated as quite good, in fact, and standard deviation is not too bad, supporting the hypothesis that person presuppositions are uniformly ignored in focus alternatives. This is further confirmed by cleft examples like 17 and 18. So c'est toujours moi qui t'appelle, or c'est toujours toi qui m'appelle. So it's always me who calls you, or it's always you who calls me. whose intended interpretations were both rated as easily available, so namely, so you never call me or I never call you, conversely. But so this example, which does not involve ellipsis, but just focus, now requires further examination because it relies on the availability of supersloppy readings in focus constructions, which is the second open problem in my recent analysis based on English. So most examples of bound or sloppy readings of indexicals, like 6, involve focus constructions with only. And as we saw, that's why the real indexical approach hypothesizes that presuppositional person features of bound pronoun can be ignored under focus. And furthermore, the assumption is that focus alternatives or involved in both focal and elliptical constructions, so that the same analysis extends to examples like 13 with ellipsis. Now, so far, we have only seen examples of supersloppy readings in elliptical constructions, like 1, I love you, I do too. But given that my analysis reduces supersloppy to sloppy readings, I predict that supersloppy readings should also arise in focus constructions like 19, only I love you. So I did test the prediction using examples like 20 and 21 in English. So Tom is talking to his partner Sue in a ballroom dancing class involving 10 other couples. And he tells her, only I didn't make you fall over, meaning the other dancers made their partner fall over. Or conversely, Sue tells Tom, only you made me swirl, meaning the other dancers did not make their partner swirl. And they turned out to be reasonably acceptable for speakers, although not as good as examples in ellipsis constructions. That was a significant difference. So under the indexical E-type analysis I proposed, the focus alternatives here involve the property of making one's interlocutor fall over or making one's interlocutor swirl, respectively. And so crucially, applying this analysis to these examples implies quantification over context, since inter only takes discourse participants in its domain, and the relevant alternatives are dancers, different dancers in the class. So instead of assuming this, for English, which does not exhibit indexical shifts, I hypothesize that these readings derive from complex focus. So with focus on I and you in 20, or you and me in 21. So just like only can associate with both Bill and Sue in 22. John only introduced Bill to Sue, where we have quantification over pairs of individuals this time. And indeed, note that the questionnaires were written, so the prosody was not controlled for. So furthermore, there are several empirical arguments for this hypothesis. So first, examples like 20, only I didn't make you fall over, were rated as acceptable, so no significant difference, with examples like 23 involving two proper names and thus requiring complex focus. Like only Tom made Sue swirl, namely the other dancers did not make their partners swirl. Second, examples like 20 were rated as acceptable as examples like 24, involving one proper name and one indexical. And such examples can only derive from complex focus, so not from an indexical E-type analysis, since this is the configuration we showed in 9 does not yield indexical E-type readings. And in fact, Jacobson specifies that 9 is infelicitous only if me is not stressed. Third, these examples are also as acceptable as examples like 25, which do not involve C commands between me, you and me, which we saw were not acceptable in ellipsis constructions. Right? So in some, supersloppy readings in focus constructions should not be analyzed using an indexical E-type control, as I argued should be the case in ellipsis, and would require quantification over context here. But they can simply derive from complex focus, which explains the intermediate rating similar to the rating of other examples involving complex focus. And note that conversely, we cannot, of course, extend the complex focus analysis to ellipsis examples since the elided pronoun cannot be stressed. But now there is one type of focus examples which should be analyzable using an indexical E-type analysis without requiring quantification over context. So these are examples like 26 and 27 that do not involve alternative context, since the only relevant alternatives are the speaker and the addressee of the actual speech act. Right? So Samantha is on the phone with her mother, and the mother tells Samantha, only I call you regularly, meaning you don't call me regularly. So the only alternatives are you and me. And conversely, only you call me regularly, meaning I don't call you regularly. So here the prediction is that these examples should be acceptable under both complex focus and indexical E-type analysis. But surprisingly, they turned out to be degraded in the English questionnaire. So I speculated that this may be due to multiple ambiguity, or maybe the cost of pragmatic work to restrict the alternatives to the two discourse participants. But so now I want to show that French can help us clarify this issue. So why? Because we can exclude the possibility of complex focus by using clitics in positions where they cannot be stressed. So let's consider 28. So Françoise is on the phone with her friend, she's complaining. C'est toujours comme ça, de nous deux, il n'y a que moi qui t'appelle. So it's always like this, among the two of us, I am the only one who call you, meaning you never call me. So here, you, so is a clitic te with an elided vowel because it's before verb starting with a vowel. So it cannot presumably bear focal stress, meaning only an indexical E-type analysis is possible. Double focus is not. Furthermore, note that I made the relevant alternatives explicit, so between the two of us, de nous deux, which presumably reduces the cost of pragmatic work. And in such configurations, the results are drastically different than in English. So the examples are rated as perfectly acceptable. So it's 5 out of 6, which shows that indexical E-type analysis is possible in focal constructions. So the same holds for example 17 I showed you earlier, involving a clef construction, right? C'est toujours moi qui t'appelle, it's always me who calls you, you never call me. And finally, this is confirmed by examples that do not require any experimental testing, like 29, which is the title, by the way. So I love you too. Because here, focus alternatives are also involved due to the focus particle aussi, so tu. And the second indexical, clitic with an elided vowel, cannot be stressed either. So in sum, French data allow us to settle both issues, English data left open, thanks to the availability of unstressable clitics. So first, they confirm that supersloppy readings in focus constructions are available without double focus, which shows that the indexical E-type analysis can be applied to focus constructions as expected, in fact. And second, they reveal that person reversal is acceptable in both directions, which shows that person presuppositions can be ignored in focus alternatives. So now, what are the analytical consequences? So these data support the hypothesis that supersloppy readings behave like sloppy readings of Indexical. So they arise in both ellipsis and focus constructions and only there. And they suggest that person features of bound pronouns can be ignored in focus alternatives. Furthermore, they provide support for the real indexical analysis of bound indexicals versus the fake one, because only as real indexicals can they be analyzed as indexical E-type pronouns. So in other words, the fact that they are real indexical explains the constraints on their distribution as E-type pronouns. So in 13, the property of doing one's homework is copied into the ellipsis side without the person presupposition that the referent should be the speaker. And so similarly in 1, the property of loving one's interlocutor is copied into the ellipsis side without the presupposition that the referent is the addressee, right? So this is parallel. But now I'd like to further refine the role of person features I assumed in Supersloppy readings. So to recap, my hypothesis so far are that first, person's features are presuppositional, which I take from Cooper, Hyman-Kretzer, etc. Second, that indexicals can only be construed as E-type pronouns if they remain indexical under that construal, which is a new hypothesis. And third, person features of bound pronouns can be ignored in focus alternatives, which I take from Heim, Jacobson, or Zauerland, for example.
10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So now I'd like to link the first two hypotheses and modify the relevance of the third one. So to link the first two hypotheses, so the reason why indexicals must remain indexical under when they are construed as E-type pronouns is that their presuppositions must be satisfied even under E-type readings, which is the default hypothesis. And so this presupposition then must derive from the hidden description used for E-type pronouns, that is, in our case, inter encodes the person presupposition of indexicals. So in fact, we can reformulate the definition of inter as involving the presupposition that its arguments must be discourse participants, which entails the correct presupposition for the whole E-type pronoun. And so this explains why 9 was not acceptable, because here the intended hidden description spouse cannot derive the person presupposition, since a spouse certainly can, but crucially need not be a discourse participant. So this makes predictions for gender, which seem to be borne out. So we can test it if we modify Jacobson's example as in 30. So this year, everyone was supposed to bring their baby, but only Michael brought her. So here it's difficult to use the feminine pronoun, at least in French, I can judge. So why? Because so elle, her, presupposes that the referent is female. So under my hypothesis, the E-type construal should retain this presupposition, but a baby need not be female. So that's why it's degrading. But we can compare this with 31. This year, everyone was supposed to bring their daughter, but only Michael brought her. Here, it's perfectly fine to use the feminine pronoun as an E-type pronoun, because the description daughter also presupposes that the referent is female. And a similar prediction is made for a number, right? So this year, everyone was supposed to bring their baby, but only Michael brought them. Here, it's infelicitous, even if we mean his twins, because them presupposes that the referent is plural, a presupposition that is not retained in the description, his baby. And again, this contrasts with 33, with this year everyone was supposed to bring their kids, but only Michael brought them, which is perfectly fine. So what I hypothesize then is that under the E-type reading of indexicals, the description, namely inter, encodes the person presupposition. Therefore, the person presupposition that I added in my 2019 analysis is in fact redundant, because I assume that I love you is I love the inter of X, and that the inter of X must be the addressee of the context. But now that we have clarified that the presupposition of you is in fact satisfied by because of the definition of the hidden description inter, we need not add the second one. This does not mean that we do not have any person presupposition. There is one on the argument of inter, I assume, because you is the inter of me, and me presupposes that the referent is the speaker now. So therefore, the third hypothesis is still relevant, but it does not concern a presupposition associated with the whole E-type pronoun, which does not disappear in focus alternatives since it has been transmitted as a presupposition of a predicate, inter. But it concerns the presupposition associated with the variable inside the E-type pronoun. So this, I think, simplifies my previous analysis by making super sloppy readings more parallel to sloppy readings, and by clarifying the constraints on E-type construals. So now we have a better idea of why person indexicals are usually resistant to E-type construals. It's because only descriptions that can retain their person presuppositions can be used, and there is arguably only one such description, and inter. So to finish, I'd like to mention an issue that the French data leave open. So remember, I argued that readings in 20 and 21 do not derive from an indexical E-type analysis, but from complex focus in English, where it's possible to stress both indexicals. And this allowed us to avoid quantification of a context that would be required by an indexical E-type analysis here. But the French questionnaire shows that similar examples in French with an unstressable clitic are in fact as acceptable. And in fact, they are as acceptable as example with a strong pronoun, which can be stressed, right? So, dans cette soirée, il n'y a que moi qui t'écoute vraiment. So Clement takes part in a speed dating event. After having a look at the other couples, he told his interlocutor, dans cette soirée, il n'y a que moi qui t'écoute vraiment. In this event, only I am really listening to you is an unstressed clitic. Versus in this event, only I am singing for you, il n'y a que moi qui chante pour toi with a strong pronoun, which can be stressed. So here, the complex focus analysis is only possible in B with the strong pronoun, but not in A. But since they got the same kind of result, this means that we should have quantification over context in A with the indexical E-type analysis. Namely, here U is construed as the inter of me, so that the relevant property to be computed in the focus alternatives is the property of really listening to one's interlocutor. And to obtain the intended interpretation, we therefore need to assume that alternative context can be accessed. Since here, basically each other man needs to be the speaker of an alternative context. So this hypothesis seems further supported by the fact that the reading is not available if there is no C command, as in 35, only the choreography I chose made you laugh. And because we saw that C command is required for the indexical E-type analysis. But now the problem is that this hypothesis is, however, disproved by two facts. So first, this reading is similarly unavailable without C command with strong pronouns, which should allow complex focus. So in 36, il n'y a que les gens de ma famille qui ne font jamais de remarques sur toi. So only the people in my family never make comments about you. Here there is no C command, but you can be stressed, so toi. So we should get the readings, but in fact, it's degrading. And conversely, super sloppy readings are available with indexical clitics and a third person pronoun in 37, which should not license indexical E-type construal, since the third person pronoun cannot be an argument of inter. So this time, il n'y a qu'elle qui ne m'écoute pas, only she does not listen to me, where me cannot be stressed. So the results are somehow contradictory, which does not allow to reach a firm conclusion on this, on quantification over context. So I leave the issue open for now. So to conclude, so the novel French data I presented allow us to simplify the analysis of supersloppy readings I recently proposed based on English data by providing evidence for the availability of indexical E-type pronouns in both ellipsis and focus constructions, and by confirming that person presuppositions of bound pronouns can be ignored in focus constructions. So supersloppy readings are thus fully parallel to sloppy readings of Indexical. Furthermore, they have led me to hypothesize a new constraints on E-type pronouns, namely 5 features must be encoded by the hidden description used for E-type control. And finally, we have seen that some of these data question whether we can have context quantification in languages without indexical shifts, but they were not conclusive. So in sum, I hope to have provided a new empirical argument against Kaplan's fixity theory, because indexical do not necessarily directly depend on the context, but they can depend on each other. So indexicals can be construed as descriptions, and indexicals can be bound. We have also provided new insights into E-type pronouns. So first, indexicals can in fact be construed as E-type pronouns under certain circumstances. And it seems that the feature information of E-type pronouns must be retained in the hidden description used for this control. So thank you again for to the organizers of the workshop and all of you for listening. And I'm happy to have questions or comments.
Thank you, Isabel. Thank you so much for your nice talk. And yeah, we do have time for questions. So if you have questions, please raise your hand. Cilene.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
I actually can't see you here. Something's wrong with my Zoom. But thank you, Isabel. It was a wonderful talk. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
I'm working with schizophrenics, and they do have a lot of problems with pronouns. So I want to, test this kind of stuff with them, because we know that they have problems with the presuppositions. So it would be really nice to see what's going to happen. But anyway, I have a question for you, which is related to, I wonder what happens with imposters in these situations. So I can tell my kid that something like, your mother loves you, but I don't think that he can answer me too, right? Mm-hmm. So the fact that you have an imposter there will actually block the phenomenon you were observing. And I don't know, I don't think that you can, I'm not sure I can say only to my son, only your mother calls you, meaning you don't call her. It's just weird in this context, right? Mm-hmm.
So your mother loves you.
Your mother loves you, but he cannot answer me too.
Right, but so here, yeah, and this is maybe even more surprising in the sense that in principle, you could maybe be bound by your mother, right? Even if there is strictly no C command, but it's been shown that when it's the possessive, it's fine. But I think if he replies, well, your son, I mean, I don't know if we can reply, your son does too. Or,
oh yeah, that your son does too.
But
that's joke. That would be just a joke, right? I don't think that's possible. Yeah. Not even in Portuguese, right? Sua mãe te ama. Seu filho. He can say o filho dela também. Her son too. But your son too? No. No.
But here, in a sense, I mean, under my analysis, if you is analyzed as my interlocutor, I mean, the question arises as to whether my can be bound by your mother. Here, you don't have a first person pronoun. I mean, even, well, first we could check with sloppy reading simply.
Yeah.
But your mother's, well, no, that's weird, right? Your mother loves me, meaning I love myself. No, it doesn't work either, right? So,
Yeah.
but no, but you're right that it's worth investigating this with imposters.
Yeah.
Maybe I have a related question that I could make if I may. I think it's related because I think that one of the predictions, but maybe I'm wrong, of what you are saying is that I love you should mean the same as I love my interlocutor, my addressee. But then you cannot, if I say I love my addressee, if I answer me too, it's really, I don't know, it's not good. It doesn't mean the same in a sense. But maybe I, just not understand.
I love my, so what do you think it means?
It like if you say I love my interlocutor and I am the interlocutor and I say me too, the feeling that I have is that I love myself. Which is not what I know. Maybe I
mean, this should be ambiguous. So this should, because as usual, I mean, but that's interesting, like to check this. I haven't even checked that indeed. So I love my addressee. So either you should have the strict reading, so which is the reading that you get. So this is fine. This is predicted that we should get I love me too. But the thing is, indeed, we should also be able to get I love you too, because if my is, this time if it would be a sloppy reading, in fact, my would be bound by I, and then the same in the ellipsis side, so that would be I love my addressee too. I love my addressee, I do too. But it's harder to get, really. Yeah, so that's interesting. Maybe, I mean, then there is a question of why do you use my addressee when you can use you? Maybe there is something.
Yes, of course, that would be like a semanticist question, right? The semanticist speaking, but yeah, it would be funny. But anyways, I don't know.
No, but you're right. It's relevant. It's interesting. Okay, thank you. I'll think more about that. Yeah. Anna, I see that.
Anna?
Hang on, I have to put my hand down and I have to find, there we go. I was wondering if you'd care to say a little more about the part you had to go quickly over, which is about the QUD relevance, just out of curiosity, what your thoughts are about that. I don't have anything specific in mind. I'd just like to know.
Sure. And I briefly mentioned this because there was a talk about this at Bedeutung recently. Let me see. Where was it? Here, I think. Yes. So yes, here I mentioned that when I retested the data, I made sure that reciprocity between discourse participants was under discussion. Because yes, what I didn't talk about is, so in general, I mean, there is a whole discussion in research on E-type pronouns about how there can be license with issues about what the so-called formal link and all this thing. So usually the description, I mean, I guess the standard claim is that the description must be somehow available in the discourse. Here it's different. This is a bit different because interlocutor is not available in the discourse, like as such, it's not mentioned. So my assumption was, but still something must, it's not pragmatically neutral. It must, the notion of interlocutor must be pragmatically salient to get this interpretation. And well, the way to make it salient is to have reciprocity between the two discourse participants and their discussion. So yeah, so here the assumption is, because I said in principle, you can always be interpreted as my interlocutor semantically, but there are pragmatic restrictions. And so this would be the pragmatic restriction. You cannot always interpret you as my interlocutor. For that, the discourse has to make salient that it's relevant to talk about interlocutor. And so this can be done by, by having reciprocity under discussion. So here the question would be, do we spot each other? So the reciprocity is under discussion. Does it
that seemed really interesting. And I mean, because I do remember, I think in your book, you had some examples where the issue was not, so where the context was not right. And then this kind of recovery of the interlocutor interpretation wasn't available. And so I remember that. And so I guess, so I just want to understand, because I mean, so the idea is that it's about something being reciprocal that's under discussion, right? I mean, because in principle, I mean, I guess you could recover interlocutor, I mean, you know, and whenever you speak, right? But in a sense,
yes,
or to somebody at least, not to yourself maybe. But I guess the issue of the QUD being reciprocity was what's crucial, right? Is that the way you are thinking about it?
I mean, no, you're completely right. That's a point that I have not fully investigated in full detail. And so that's the, so inspired by this talk, as I mentioned.
Yeah, I haven't read that, so I apologize.
Yeah, no,
I look for that, yeah.
So, well, in fact, she argues against my analysis, and because she thinks everything can be done pragmatically if we work with questions under discussion. I think that in fact we can complement it, because something is indeed missing in my analysis, namely how to license inter, and I liked her approach of. But basically, you're right that we need to specify exactly how interlocutor can be licensed, because the observation, and that was already noticed in other notes about this, usually these Supersloppy readings are licensed when there is some kind of either fight or negotiation. I mean, certain kinds of discourse interrelations.
Yeah. And
so why? Because you're right, in principle, as long as I'm talking, I have an interlocutor.
No, but I think your point about this being about reciprocity, and of course, inter is in a sense reciprocal.
Right.
So that makes sense. So but I was wondering your thoughts on that. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, no. Thank you for asking about this important point.
We still have time for one question. If nobody has, can I don't know if can I ask you to because you went very quickly on the experiment where you didn't get the meaning that you were supposed to get for English, and because there was a context, and I was wondering whether that might come from the context. And not this one, the ones that...
Oh, you mean which example specifically?
The ones like only blah, 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 only you.
Oh, with the context. At the end, the open issue. Right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Those ones, yeah, probably.
In French or in English?
In English. It was in English, or it was in French, or it was in French, I think. But I was wondering about the context, because
so these ones were the
this one, because
from English.
Those ones exactly, because you said that you didn't get the results that you were expecting, right? With those
not
ones.
For these ones. No, for this one is more like for these ones in English, I got they are understandable if we assume there are people do complex focus. They focus both pronouns. So then they're rated just like if you have two proper names, for instance. So you focus both names and you quantify over pairs of individuals. So you don't need quantification. But then what the problem is in French.
Oh, I see.
If you use an example where you cannot stress the second indexical, so for instance, here in this event, only I am recently listening to you, where it's il n'y a que moi qui t'écoute vraiment. So here it's an elided T, so you cannot stress it. It's still rated the same. So meaning you cannot have complex focus. So that means, if I'm right, you have to use the analysis I proposed in ellipsis, namely only I'm really listening to the interlocutor of me.
The other ones.
But then that means that to get the interpretation, none of the other men is really listening to his own interlocutor. You need to quantify over context, because you need to make each other man the speaker of an alternative context.
I see.
I mean, why not in principle, even if this is not standard, because I mean, usually we say in English and French, there is no quantification over context. But then the empirical problem I have is that well, there are two issues. I get this. I also get this type of readings when I have a non-indexical. So only she does not listen to me. I mean, here one possibility is that maybe she can be analyzed as my interlocutor itself. I don't know. And the reverse problem, so maybe I would need to use the proper name instead. I don't know. The reverse problem is that when there is no secament and I have a strong pronoun, here we should be able to get double focus, but still it's bad. So I don't know why you cannot have complex focus. But did you have a specific question about these examples? Or?
No, I was just wondering whether the context, because you give some context, right?
Yes. Yeah. Before
could have an influence on what was going on. I was just wondering.
So what I did is in the questionnaires, as you saw, I had two conditions. I mean, more conditions, but one for Supersloppy reading, one for strict readings. And in fact, I intentionally biased the context to allow the intended reading to see if we can get it or not in each case. So indeed, here the context is supposed to make that reading possible in each case. So, I mean, I hope so. Maybe.
Yeah, it's clear now. So then you had two types of context with two predictions for each context. So one context should give you one interpretation, and the other one should bias for the other. Okay.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you for your questions and comments.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
And now we have Professor Anna Ahegli, and